Hassasu, how do you see what Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi is part of this constitutional committee, how he's been explaining this? Do you agree with this being essentially the Syrian regime's delaying tactics in not coming to the point which is right now to be addressed, the constitution itself?
It obviously looks like that, and as the Mr. Spokesman mentioned, the Syrian regime is talking about stuff which has to be talked about later on at the process of writing the constitution. The Syrian people needs to see really solid steps towards that, and it's very basic, simple. The Syrian regime and the opposition, together with the other civil rights society members, they are gathered here to write the constitution, which opens the path in front of a new Syria, to open the way for a solution in Syria, and that is after reestablishing the country and taking the country step by step to an election that makes the Syrian people to decide what kind of country they want. This is that simple, but the Syrian regime seems to be trying to gain some time in order to stop this process or slow this process. In previous peace talks, like in Geneva, we've witnessed the regime putting more force on the ground during the negotiations to put pressure on the opposition party. But now it seems like the regime doesn't have the power on the ground to really push the opposition in Syria, but instead they are trying to gain some time on the table with these kind of maneuvers. And I don't see the Syrian regime being serious about it, since they know it goes to the Syrian regime. They are trying to protect the Syrian regime with these kind of political maneuvers.
But Mr. Hassasu, how far can they keep doing this? End of October, we saw the first round of these talks began, and these are UN-sponsored talks. And as Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi has also mentioned, there's a lot of pressure from the Russian side. I mean, they're supporting Bashar al-Assad. And when they go ahead and make these moves, the Syrian government, these delaying tactics, how far do you think they can take this until finally something has to be done?
Well, it's pretty much related to what's going on the field. There are negotiations or talks between the Russians and Turks and maybe with the Iranians with Syrians, and who knows, maybe the Syrian regime with SDF and other groups on the ground. So it is really dependent on what's we are going to see in the field within the next couple of days or weeks, maybe. But the Syrian regime will try to gain as much as time for themselves, no matter what will be the result of these efforts. So it doesn't have to be, gaining some specific amount of time for some target. The Syrian regime actually doesn't have anything else to do right now except trying to do what they couldn't on the field, on the table right now. And it looks like they are trying to stop and slow the process.
There have been, well, by some very conservative estimates, 370,000 people, Syrians who have lost their lives in this, in this Syrian war, upwards of 570 by some estimates. Over 6 million people have become refugees. But when we see this kind of an outcome of an important constitutional committee meeting where the government walks out or delays, employs delaying tactics, the opposition groups and the civil society groups who are part of this panel in Geneva right now, they must be really angry.
I think that this path will lead to nothing. This is just a game, as Bashar al-Assad said. And I think that the opposition is totally wrong to engage with this path, actually. As you mentioned, there is no timetable at all. They might reach to the draft of constitution, but maybe after unlimited years, maybe after 10 years, Bashar al-Assad will be elected again in 2022. So that similar to what's happened in Geneva process. Why is that? The process of drafting the constitution is more important than the constitution result itself. That's how we learn the constitution law. The constitution usually drafted when the conflict ended and after negotiation by the parties. Then they sit on the table and start writing the draft of the constitution. On contrary, what's happened in Syria, the conflict is still firing. 3 days ago, Bashar al-Assad is shelled IDP camps in Al-Qa'. And yesterday and today he's seizing more territories and villages from Idlib, West Syria, torturing people. So crimes against humanity and war crimes are still exist. The conflict are still exist. How we are sitting with this regime and some part of the opposition and fake, actually, those the most of this organization are fake organization, which is some of them actually linked to the Assad security forces group. Some of them are fake organization or individuals, and they give them this term, civil society, which is actually not true at all. Those are gathered and collected from everywhere to say that, but we are the civil society are monitoring what's going on. And we issued 2 reports, actually. One report at the first round of this which alleged Constitution Committee. And we mentioned how many civilians is killed by Assad regime and how many war crimes are committed. And we are monitoring and doing the same, the same things for this round to actually reveal that this path will lead to nothings.
But Mr. Ghany, isn't it too much to expect that a ceasefire of sort or, a holding off by all of those involved, whether it is not just the Syrian regime, but also the foreign forces involved there, Russia, Turkey, to hold off on everything until the Constitutional Committee comes together with a plan? I mean, isn't that too far off to expect as a possibility?
A smart question, actually. But now we are talking about 2 parties who is engaged in this process, which is one party is the Syrian regime. So that we are requesting from those parties, and the other party is the opposition. Now we are not talking about others, for example, the Russian or SDF. Now we are monitoring those violations from those parties, which they should stop, actually. Which doesn't actually. Assad regime didn't reveal the fate of thousands of disappeared, which they are still in his center detention. So without this actually process, that will lead to nothing. The second important issue is actually, and I think the opposition is dreaming actually. What Dr. Yahya, with full of respect, this is just dreaming. Drafting a constitution without removing hundreds of injustice law, which still exists in Syria, that lead to nothing actually. So that our request is a transitional body. This transitional body have the authority to draft the constitution and also to change the injustice law, the law which is hundreds of law, which is against the human rights law, which exists and protected the Assad security forces, protected Assad law. That's the most important, and that I think the opposition, it might be absent from this argument, or they are but they are also want to play a role, or they want to engage in spite of this.
No, but Mr. Ghany, who would make that transitional? Who would consist of that transitional government? Who could be possibly placed in that position? Who would be that's essentially taking the Syrian regime into account for their atrocities. I mean, who would be able to do that in Syria at this point?
I think a very important question again. Let me refer to all of the Security Council resolution, to Geneva 1, Resolution 2118, 2254. None of them actually refer to Constitutional Committee. From where this idea is created? From Sochi conference, which is taken care by Russia. So this is the reference of the Constitution Committee. Then actually the UN is engaged. But all of those resolution and Geneva 1 also, all of them referring to transitional body. The opposition should reject actually this process and path, which is leading to nothing. It's actually, as I mentioned, should be transitional body, lead to the Constitution Committee and lead to election committee, and have the authority to also changing the injustice law, and also have the authority to monitor the election. All of the authority will be in this transitional body. Otherwise, now Constitution Committee without actually legitimate reference. Who's the reference for this committee actually?
So, Mr. Ghany, Mr. John Hassasu, what role could the Turks play here, the Russians could play here in getting Bashar al-Assad essentially to come to the negotiation table and then to agree to back off, considering that he's finally in a position where he's recaptured a lot of land that he had lost back a few years ago, 2015?
Well, actually, Mr. Ghany made very good technical points about the talks, and he's really right to say that. But I think, as he mentioned as well, the opposition is trying to gain some time and plus some attention to its problem, and it doesn't want to be the part which hides from these kind of efforts, and it continues to be present there and to represent the Syrian people and the opposition. Turkey, at the other side, from the beginning, is against the Syrian regime and Assad's regime, to be specific. And Turkey is against Assad because the people, the opposition, doesn't want to be under the rule of Assad or his Ba'ath regime in this country anymore. So they will continue to support this demand of the Syrian people, and they have been pushing for this in their talks with the Russians and the Iranians. But I think before talking to the Syrian regime, Turkey is going to try to find a solution to the problem with the Russians and the Iranians, and I think this is a step, but it's not the whole path or the solution to the problem. But we will continue to talk about the matter since we don't have any clear indication of these talks between Turkey and Russia and Iran, fresh talks, I mean.
Right.
But I expect fresh talks on this problem in the upcoming days.
Right, but Mr. Hassasu, I understand that there is a lack of clarity at the moment with so much going on, but at the same time, I mean, we're seeing how Russia is reacting to the suggestions from Turkey of a new offensive. I mean, they're not very confident that this might be the right solution at this point, because a big question on what would happen to those areas in the buffer zone? Who's taking control of it? There is a lot of resistance on the ground from those who have been displaced from here in northeast Syria about the regime coming back and taking power. So isn't this an opportunity where Turkey can play that role to not just clear out the area of YPG, but also impose a kind of a pressure point on the Syrian regime to cede?
Turkey's foreign policy is based on creating consensus between its allies, neighbors, or the parties in this founding solution efforts, and it's trying to be not aggressive, but cooperating with the situation and try to not give more harm to the region after it went through all these years. So in this term, Turkey is trying to make the other side, the Iranians and the Russians, to really agree on its thesis. And I think Turkey will continue to insist on its demands. Iran is in a different position these days. Wherever Iranian influence is strong, like Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and right, including Iran mainland itself, there are problems. And these problems actually will have an effect on the Iranian side of this deal. So I think within the upcoming days, we will see clear steps taken by the Turkish authorities or together with the Russians about solving the problem. But it doesn't mean that Turkey is giving up from its efforts to solve the problem, specifically inside Syria.
Right. And Mr. Ghany, since running out of time, last question to you. I want to put in a lot here. I want to also acknowledge that there have been protests here going on in northeastern Syria by the displaced people for weeks now on end, protesting the Syrian regime's presence back in places which were first controlled by the YPG. Now, that having been said, what's your take on, given the condition on the ground, the kind of sort of futility of this Constitutional Committee meeting in Geneva? Can Turkey play that positive role in bringing Bashar al-Assad to a point where he is forced to negotiate and speak with the opposition groups?
I think that the role of Turkey is very huge, and the influence is positive influence in the Syria conflict, and I think they can do much better in this regard, especially with the negotiation with the Russian, because like the negotiation with the Russian is difficult, as Russian forces still support totally the Assad crimes and committed also as the New York Times investigation and our investigation continue to attack the hospitals and the medical centers. I think that those crimes actually the main reason of the ITP, the main reason of the refugees. The people still terrifying. More negotiation with Russian and pressure in this regard actually with getting support from the Syrian population, which is like against those behavior from Russian and also some European country and the US. I think that we can change these rules. Finally, this process actually, the Constitution Committee, Assad create the constitution in 2012, and the aim of that to give him legitimacy again. Who is admit this constitution is Iranian and Russian only. Now this process will give Assad legitimacy with care from the UN and from the several. Actually, this is the dangerous of this process actually. Without taking care that this process will lead and end this security forces ruling in Syria and Assad authority, that will lead to nothing actually. IDP still will never go back to their houses, the refugees as well. Right. Yeah, of course, totally. We have a report actually what they faced when they go back. Torture disappeared again. Recruiting them. So
it's a difficult balance, essentially, how the Constitutional Committee meeting goes ahead, because one has to also keep in mind the kind of powers that be might just reinforce the presence of the Syrian regime in the war-torn Syria. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. I had to cut you there, Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, but thank you so much for joining us. Also you, Mr. Jan Hassasu. And with that, we've come to the end of the program. We will be back tomorrow with more analysis on the latest happenings around the world.